Good evening, everyone. I'm Arnie Eisen, the Chancellor of JTS, and I want to welcome you to this evening's LeZion and Baruch and Bokser Memorial Lecture. Some of you may be at JTS for the first time, and we especially want to extend a warm welcome to you and hope that you'll be back for many future events. There's now a ritual we all have to engage in collectively, so we take out our cell phones and we make sure that they are in the off position and do not ring. This lecture was established by Mrs. Kalya Bokser, Zichronah Livracha, and her daughter-in-law, my good friend, Dr. Ann Wimpfheimer, as a tribute to their late husbands, Rabbi Ben-Zion Bokser and Rabbi Dr. Baruch M. Bokser, Zichronam Livracha, with the goal of furthering their academic areas of interest, namely Talmud, Jewish ethics, and ancient and rabbinic Judaism, and reminded me that it's an especially fortuitous combination of these interests tonight because we have the rabbinic Judaism connected to ethics, which for both Ben-Zion and Baruch was not just something they studied. It was what they were. Everyone who knew them as supremely ethical individuals and really, standards of reference for that endeavor in life. And it's a privilege for us to host this lecture this evening. Rabbi Ben-Zion Bokser was ordained at JTS in 1931, served for over 50 years as spiritual leader of the Forest Hills Jewish Center in Queens, and made major contributions to the conservative movement and to Klal Yisrael, which resonate to this day. Rabbi Baruch M. Bokser, who was ordained at JTS in 1971, Ann's late husband and the son of Rabbi Ben-Zion and Mrs. Kalya Bokser, served with distinction on the JTS faculty, and his signal scholarship continues to enlighten and enrich our understanding of our tradition. I'm pleased to recognize the presence with us this evening of our friend, Dr. Ann Wimpfheimer, and to thank her for her generous support for the Bokser Lecture. Thank you, Ann. It's our great pleasure and high honor to be joined by tonight's speaker, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, Rabbi Daniel Sinclair, and his topic will be patient autonomy in the dying process, a Jewish perspective. I was talking about this with Ann a minute ago. I think it's fair to say that this is not one of those topics that is esoteric. This is one of the most difficult issues that those of us who live in this world have to face with regard to ourselves, with regard to our parents. And I myself can testify how welcome the Jewish tradition was to me when I confronted this awful situation of needing to make decisions in this area, and I'm sure I'm speaking for many of those here, so we're very much looking forward to this evening's lecture. As an institution deeply committed to halakhah, to Jewish law, as well as to Jewish ethics, which is of course intimately intertwined with halakhah, JTS is an ideal venue for tonight's presentation by Dr. Sinclair. In this regard, I'm very pleased to announce what some of you may not know, that in the fall of 2014, JTS is going to launch a new MA program in Jewish ethics, which will enable students to specialize in legal, environmental, business, and medical ethics. Students will explore how to engage the Jewish ethical tradition in their personal and professional lives. If you wish to learn more about this program, you'll have an opportunity to do so upon the conclusion of tonight's lecture by speaking with the program's director, Dr. Michal Rauscher, who is here with us this evening. Michal. So if people want to learn more about the program, please speak to Michal after the event. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Sinclair is currently the Wolff Fellow in Jewish Law and visiting professor of law at Fordham University Law School in New York City. He's also a full professor of Jewish law and comparative biomedical law at the Haim School of Law at the College of Management Academic Studies, COMAS, in Rishon, LeZion, Israel, and adjunct professor of comparative biomedical law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In the course of his doctoral studies at the Hebrew University, Professor Sinclair was awarded the prestigious Yaakov Herzog Memorial Prize in Jewish law. Dr. Sinclair has published more than 50 articles in the field of comparative biomedical law and Jewish law, and on the influence of Jewish law on the legal system of the State of Israel, the relationship between halakhah and ethics, and the jurisprudence of Jewish law. He's the author of Tradition and the Biological Revolution, and of Jewish Biomedical Law, legal and extra-legal dimensions. He's also edited the volumes Law, Judicial Policy, and Jewish Identity in the State of Israel and Jewish Biomedical Law in Israel. It's now my great pleasure to call to the podium Dr. Daniel Sinclair to deliver tonight's Bokser Memorial Lecture. Dr. Sinclair.
Thank you. Several years ago, quite a few in fact, Rabbi Moses Feinstein was once referred to in the Philadelphia Inquirer as an elderly Jewish sage from the Lower East Side in a very famous case that he was involved in known as the Lakewood Twins. Rabbi Feinstein was approached by a young man, relatively young, very orthodox, from Brooklyn, with a halachic question. The question was that the young man had been diagnosed with a very serious and debilitating disease. From being healthy, fit, and capable of leading an interesting and enjoyable lifestyle, committed, of course, to the highest principles of halakhah and orthodox way of life, he was faced with a severely shortened lifespan and an extremely limited life, wheelchair, constant intubation, medical attention. And he just heard that in Germany there was a physician who developed a cure for his particular disease. Now here he was, faced with his truncated lifespan and having a very miserable time in terms of quality of life. And he's entranced with the idea that he will be able to get up out of the wheelchair, go back to playing squash or whatever it is they do in Flatbush, and he would be able to obtain tremendous quality of life. But there's a catch, and there's often a catch. Catch was that there was at least a 75% chance that he would die. 75% plus chance that he would die. He asked Rabbi Feinstein, can I undertake this highly risky procedure in order to change my life, make it much more positive, or must I accept the fact that God has sent this disease and I will live for however long I have in this very poor condition and will accept my fate? So what should I do from a halachic perspective? Well, one's intuitive reply as a halachist and a talmudist would be that we are not in charge of our lives. We are stewards over them on behalf of God. And life is of infinite value. Every second counts. And there is a concept in the Talmud known as chayei sha'ah, short-term life. Now, even if somebody is faced with a few years or a few months or a few minutes, they're under a halachic obligation to live. One's life does not belong to one. Maimonides puts this in context of the law of ransom. In Jewish law, one may not offer a ransom for the sake of being let off capital punishment, because Maimonides says, "Ein nafsho shel adam kinyano hu ela kinyan hakadosh baruch hu." That we don't own our lives and our bodies; they belong to God, and we are mere stewards, and therefore we cannot possibly offer to replace the life of somebody who was murdered with money. God said, "A life for a life." That's what has to be done. We may not endanger ourselves. There is a halachic prohibition on self-endangerment. There's a halachic prohibition on suicide. So the intuitive answer that one might have expected of Rabbi Feinstein was, accept your role, accept your lot. This is what God has destined for you. You may not prejudice your short-term life expectancy and that low quality of life in the hope of a fantastic recovery, but the odds of surviving are very, very small. Now, Rabbi Feinstein did not in fact give that answer. He basically told the young man that if he wants to, he can go ahead and he can undertake and go through that very risky operation. And the question, of course, is upon what did he base his conclusion? Now, Rabbi Feinstein went to the Talmud, of course, and in Tractate Avodah Zarah 26, we read about a case concerning a non-Jewish physician. In other words, the question is, are you allowed as a Jew in the Talmudic period to go to a non-Jewish heathen physician? The assumption is that a heathen physician will kill you rather than cure you. This is the assumption. I'm not going to go into it, but that's what the text says. Now, the Talmud, of course, says, what happens if you're really ill and there's no Jewish physician available? Talmud says, well, if you're really ill and you're faced with death, you may go to a non-Jewish physician. And then the question is, on what basis does the Talmud arrive at that ruling? Rabbi Yochanan says, well, in the book of Kings, chapter 7, there is an account of 4 lepers who were outside the gates of Samaria during a siege. Now, the siege, of course, means that the city was under famine, and there was not much to eat there, and nobody was going to provide support to lepers, Metzoraim, outside the city gate, who were basically outcasts of society anyhow. So the lepers are very hungry, and they're not sure what they ought to do, and they decide that they're going to try their luck with the Arameans. That's the enemy of Israel. So off they go to the Aramean camp after they've said and discussed and said, you know, if we stay here, we'll die. If we go to the city, we'll die. Let's go and try the enemy. They discover an empty camp. God performed a miracle. The Arameans fled. And of course, what the lepers did was that they helped themselves to a great meal, because the Arameans had fled in the middle of the night and left all of their camp intact. They then took gold and silver, which they stashed away, and they hid in a couple of holes in the ground. Then they went to the city of Samaria and told the townspeople the happy news that the siege had been raised because the Arameans had fled. Now the Gemara says, the Talmud says, well, how could the lepers have risked their lives? Clearly, there is some basis if you're faced with a very difficult situation and you're going to die. Anyhow, you can risk your life by throwing yourself upon the mercy of the enemy, who are likely to kill you because they may not do that which you think they will and ought to do. So Rabbi Feinstein goes to this piece of Talmud and says, this justifies you taking this very highly risky procedure. And he then also, and he adds to that and says, and you know what? Many people would. He uses a phrase in Aramaic called da'at ha'inshi. People would do that. And he says, before I give you my permission, of course, my full permission, we have a basis in this story in the Talmud. You have to make sure and have to convince me that this is something that people would do today, any sort of people. And apparently the young man convinced Rabbi Feinstein that this was a rational choice that inshi, which is the plural in Aramaic of people would make, and therefore he could go ahead and choose the risky operation. Now, Rabbi Feinstein asks a very interesting question here, because for those who are conversant with the Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, we know who these 4 lepers were. Who were they? They were Gehazi and his 3 sons. Now, who is Gehazi? He is the rapacious steward of the prophet Elisha. Remember the story? Naaman, the Aramean general, comes down with leprosy, and he is persuaded by a little girl, captive of the Israelites, who is in Aram at the time, to go and consult with the prophet Elisha. He might cure Naaman of his leprosy. And sure enough, Naaman goes to the land of Israel and he meets Elisha. He's not very impressed, because Elisha says, take a dip in the Jordan River. And Naaman says, look, we have much bigger and better rivers back in Aram. I mean, this is a little trickle here. But he does it anyhow. And when he comes up after the 7th ablution, his skin is as white as that of a newborn babe. And he's convinced that Elisha is a representative of the true God. And he says, when I go back to Aram, I will take a little earth from the land of Israel, and when I go to worship with my Lord, that's the king, in the house of Rishon, I will have that little bag of Israeli earth in my pocket, and we'll be thinking of you and your God, because of course I can't give up my power, prestige, and the position I have in Aram. Well, they make their fond farewells, but as Naaman's party is proceeding northward, Gehazi, Elisha's steward, appears, a little breathless because he's had to run a lot to catch up, and he says, Naaman, I have a message for you from Elisha. He's changed his mind. Please give him the check after all. Now this, of course, as you can imagine, was somewhat deflating in terms of Naaman's spiritual elation. He had thought that Elisha was a true prophet who didn't take money and was only in it for the sake of God, and therefore Naaman was really impressed. But now everything had been destroyed. That impression was no longer the positive impression, and Elisha was just like any other prophet. He was in it for his check. So Naaman takes out his pen, he signs a check, gives it to Gehazi, and we're left to speculate as to what actually happened. But when Gehazi comes back, Elisha says to him, where have you been? And Gehazi says, well, I had to go to Fairway and this and that. But, of course, Elisha knows where he's been, and the curse is that he and his 3 sons, who, according to Rabbi David Kimchi, were implicated in the scam, they are all punished with Naaman's disease. They are all lepers. In fact, the Talmud says in Sanhedrin that they are amongst the individuals who have no share in the world to come, because Chilul Hashem, they profaned the divine name. Rabbi Feinstein says, are we going to learn from 4 sinners? No share in the world to come. Who could be worse than that? And they're going to teach us a halakhic lesson about the possibility of risking your life, in even your short-term life, for the sake of gaining some longer-term life. Are they paradigms of halakhic teaching? And Rabbi Feinstein says yes. Because as long as they are rational, as long as their argument comports with that which rational people at the time would accept, this is part of halakhah. That's a very interesting comment. But Rabbi Feinstein hasn't finished, actually. He has to deal with the fact that many of the commentators on the Talmud and on Jewish law, and I refer amongst others to Rabbi Jacob Resha in his response to Shavut Yaakov, the Maharsha in his Gilyon Maharsha on Yoreh Deah, and Rabbi Haim Ozer Grudzinsky of Vilna, the Achiezer, number 16, who writes a lengthy response on this question of when you can risk your life and when you can't. Almost all of them, and others, say that risking your life in line with this statement of the Talmud in Tractate Avodah Zarah, based upon the precedent of the lepers, is only when it's what we call a safek shakul. In other words, 50-50. You can risk your short-term life if it's 50% chance of success, 50% failure. Was that the case in Rabbi Feinstein's case? No, it was not. It was 75, 25, and perhaps even 80-20. So Rabbi Feinstein pushes the envelope. He does it on the basis of what I believe is respect for personal autonomy within the interstices of the law. Feinstein understands, data inshi, that this young man wants to take the risk. It's important for him. He doesn't want to live. Perhaps other people would want to live that way. Rabbi Feinstein, by the way, provides us immediately with an economic illustration. He says, look, there's no obligation to risk your life. He says some people will be excited by the prospect of, dare I say it, in Madoff country, an investment with a huge return, and they will risk everything. Others will say, look, I have a nest egg, unless it is boilerplate, I will never risk this. Right? Feinstein says it depends upon the person. Some people will take this sort of risk, and some people will say no. So after he's given this economic illustration, he actually turns to the issue of sovereignty of our bodies. I mentioned this before. I'll say sovereignty of our lives and bodies. I mentioned the principle that Maimonides propounds. Of course, we do not go in for self-endangerment. You may not do bungee jumping over the Niagara Falls in the middle of a storm in January, okay, just for the heck of it. There are certain things you can do, okay? Talmud wonders why laborers are saying the Shema up on a tree when it's basically dangerous, and livelihood, of course, could be part of the solution. But Rabbi Feinstein has to deal with the question of, well, but surely we have to protect. And if there's no clear-cut halachic precedent for taking this risk, after all, the weight of authority seems to be on this issue, seems to be that you can only risk if it's a 50-50. What does he do with the divine ownership issue? If God hasn't allowed you to risk your life, who are you to risk it? By the way, Plato has a very similar claim. In the Phaedo, which is a discussion of afterlife and all sorts of interesting things, Socrates says to Cebes, would you agree that our lives and bodies are owned by the gods, and we cannot destroy them without their express permission? Cebes, of course, like every Platonic figure in these dialogues, agrees with everything Socrates says, and Socrates just has to bring him to the point where he says, I agree, and then, of course, falls into the trap. But that's what the Socratic method is for. And Cebes agrees, and therefore Socrates says, well, I can't commit suicide unless the laws of God permit me to. And there's a discussion about suicide, but it's interesting. Did Maimonides get his doctrine from Plato? I don't know, but you can speculate about that. It is also interesting to note that Maimonides is strongly anti-J.S. Mill. And now our modern libertarian philosophy says that people should be allowed what they want to do what they want to do, unless they're going to harm other people. Maimonides says, in this context of self-endangerment, say somebody says, you know what, I want to do something that's absolutely irresponsibly dangerous, but I'm not going to hurt anyone. Why should it bother? And Maimonides says that individual is to be given a rabbinic lashing for contumacy, is what they call it, for being stubborn. You cannot do exactly what you want. This is not Jewish law. Halakhah is not J.S. Mill, and you can do whatever you want as long as you're not going to hurt someone else. Maimonides says, the person says, and I'm not going to hurt anyone else. Let me do. The answer is no. So what does Rabbi Feinstein do with this ideology? And Rabbi Feinstein makes this amazing remark to my mind. He says there are situations in which God passes the ownership of people and their bodies to those individuals. They become the owners, and they have the right and the title, and they can make decisions even to the extent of destroying their bodies and their lives. And this, Rabbi Feinstein says, is such a case. And he argues for it very interestingly enough, in a very Talmudic fashion. He says, if it were not the case that you could, in certain circumstances, risk your life against the trend of Jewish law, in other words, take a major risk way beyond the balanced risk of Safek Shakul, how could the lepers have done what they had done? And how could Rabbi Yochanan use this as a Talmudic precedent? That, of course, is a typical Talmudic argument because it's circular. Because the lepers did what they did and Rabbi Yochanan accepts it, it must mean that you can, in fact, risk your life in certain circumstances. But that's basically Rabbi Feinstein's reply. I think it's very radical. Rabbi David Blythe, for example, a modern commentator on rabbinic law and biomedical law, has said there's no such thing in Jewish law as patient consent. In fact, we're not interested in what the patient wants at all. You are bound to do what your doctor says, and you must save your life at all costs. Now, perhaps later I will advert to an Israeli case which uses this in a most dramatic way. But in the meantime, we'll continue with Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein several years afterwards, in fact, towards the end of his life, was asked about an adult Jew, competent, who is in hospital and is undergoing artificial nutrition. So he's being fed by a tube. And the intubation comes to an end, that particular series of intubations, and now he's not being fed by a tube at all. But the hospital wants to reconnect, okay? Wants to put him back on artificial nutrition. And our elderly gentleman says no, okay? An adult, competent Jew says, no, I don't want to be connected to artificial nutrition. What's the law? What does halakhah say? Now, again, if I was to turn to regular mainstream halakhah, it's fairly clear. We have a person who is in the final stage of life. In other words, we're talking about a terminal patient. Shall we say, and without me finessing and drawing out all this in its very rich text here, shall we say somebody has 6 months or less to live? So they could enter into the category of what we call in the Talmud a gosses, somebody in the final stage of life. Now, Talmud, of course, is very insistent that we live every year, every month, every day, every minute, every second. But it does give concessions in terms of those who are in the final stage. And the concessions are played out in Tractate Smachot, one of those minor tractates which are called the Tractate of Joyful Events, but in fact it deals with death. This is a particularly Jewish practice known as Lashon Sagi Nahor. We don't like saying bad things, so we say the opposite, but you're meant to understand that, of course, the Tractate of Joyful Events deals with very miserable events. It deals with the terminal event. So that's Tractate Smachot. It makes a distinction between things that you can do and things that you can't do. It's clear that there is a time to die, and you don't have to strive officiously to keep people alive. As the poet Clough said in his parody of the commandment about murder, thou mayest not kill, but thou needest not strive officiously to keep alive, which I always regard as a nice statement of Protestantism. But that's something else, okay? Certainly, Jewish law makes concessions. Now, in what sense do we not keep people alive? Well, if we can't restore them to their health, we don't need to do all sorts of things that only stave off their deaths. Okay, now it's interesting. Chief Rabbi Lord Jacobowitz of the United Kingdom, but Germany actually, who wrote first, I think, major book in English on this field, Jewish bioethics, he explains that the Talmud derives the obligation to heal from the verse in the Torah requiring people to return lost articles. Hashavat Aveda. Now that's a little counterintuitive. I mean, why that? There is a verse in Exodus rather than this verse in Deuteronomy dealing with returning of lost articles. There's a verse in Exodus that says, you shall compensate the victim of an assault for medical expenses, which we could derive, as the Talmud does in several places, that medical treatment is a legitimate activity according to Jewish law. Why go for returning a lost article? The Talmud does. Rabbi Jacobowitz takes his cue and says that the law of returning lost articles has a detail in it that is relevant. You only return a lost article if it's returnable and it makes sense to return it. For example, if you have a very voracious creature which is lost and you have to feed it and you rack up huge bills because the only thing it eats are Black Angus steaks from Prime Grill, then you're not going to give the animal back to its owner after 6 years of this gorging because, he won't be able to pay the bill. Rabbi Jacobowitz says that you only keep people alive if it makes sense to keep them alive, if that life is worthwhile. And therefore, if somebody is going to die, and all you're doing by amputating their leg if they have gangrene, or giving them any type of treatment that's not going to cure them and bring them back to life, it's like presenting the owner of the lost article with an item which he could never afford to pay for. You're not really carrying out the obligation, the mitzvah of saving a life. So it is very well known and it's accepted in both Orthodox and conservative circles. There's an interesting debate between Rabbi Abraham Reisman and Rabbi Elliot Dorff over this very issue. But Rabbi Reisman seems to have a more conservative position, this time with a small c, and he says, and he argues that, yes, as long as we can keep someone going, then of course we have to treat everything, and they will live. If they are going to die, then we don't need to do those things that are going to keep them going for a short while, but we do have to maintain life support. In other words, nutrition, respiration, hydration must be continued until the establishment of death, and they must be administered. Okay? We're talking about withholding now. You may not withhold the basic necessities of life. Now, Jewish law regards these as being legitimate even if they are administered in an artificial fashion, which American and common law does not. Under the United States Supreme Court decision in Cruzan, the fact that you are being kept alive in an artificial way means that there is far less of an obligation to keep you alive in that artificial way. But in halakhah, apparently, we believe that we should do everything possible. We're driven, of course, by the notion of the value of life, which is a sacred principle, and we'll talk about that very shortly. But it is certainly the case that you keep on going with food, water, and air until the very end. Now, Rabbi Feinstein, of course, is confronted with this position. Position is articulated by the foremost Orthodox poskim, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in his response to Minchat Shlomo, number 91, says exactly that. And this would seem to be the regnant position. You don't need to do anything that's going to cure a side malady, something that's not going, that's there, that you're ill from, but that operation will not restore you to health. You'll still, God forbid, die of the terminal cancer, but you will die after a certain period has passed. Okay, you'll have more time. Chayei sha'ah, short-term life. That may be a very good thing from a theological perspective. Now, Rabbi Feinstein has to deal with somebody who does not want to have artificial nutrition administered to them. This is in Igrot Moshe, Choshen Mishpat, number 2, number 74. Rabbi Feinstein says, well, actually, you know what? We don't need to apply the rule of coercion. Remember, I didn't make this clear before, and I should have, but the fact that Jewish law in general requires you to save your life invites the general rabbinic discretion to force you. You can be forced under halakhah to carry out any halakhic obligation. You don't want to build a sukkah? You shall build. You refuse, we'll beat you until you say, I'm going to build a sukkah. And so on and so forth, in theory. Now, all rabbis across the board, including Orthodox, have said that today we don't force people to have their lives saved. In other words, we don't force people to do what the doctor says to save their life because there are too many uncertainties and it only applies to a certain cure. But artificial life support is fairly clear-cut. If you don't have it, you will die. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, for example, very respected Orthodox posek who died a few years ago, he says, let's coerce, force them. You may not let them give up their lives. The recalcitrant shall be forced to live. Okay? So, one would have expected Rabbi Feinstein to have followed along in that mode, but he doesn't. And why? Well, he goes to the Talmud, this time tractate Ketubot, and talks about a case in which somebody's dying and they want to give their property. They've got this fantastic villa on the Upper East Side, and they can't stand their kids, and they really want to give it to a sick cat's home. Now, you can imagine, family is not very happy, but we'll disregard them. Jewish law, of course, are not very happy with wills in the sense that we understand a will to be take effect after death, but you can certainly make a gift whilst you're still alive, even if you are barely alive. Okay? Matnat shchiv marah is what we call it in the Talmud, a deathbed gift. Now, in order to make a gift in Jewish law, you need a document, you need a scribe, you need all sorts of formalities. Say we don't have these formalities. Can we make the gift? And the Talmud says yes, we can make the gift because we don't want people to die when they are being traumatized by the knowledge that they cannot give their property to the objects to which they do wish to give it. Shema yitrof da'ato alav. Perhaps somebody will be traumatized, and we wouldn't want to traumatize them in their deaths. Feinstein then makes a kal v'chomer, typical Talmudic move, an a fortiori argument. He says, if in the case of disposing of a property, we will dispense with the formalities of Jewish law in order to allow a dying person to die peacefully, how much more when it comes to their medical treatment should we allow them to die peacefully, even if it means dispensing with the laws regarding the preservation of human life? And therefore, Rabbi Feinstein says, listen to what the guy says. You may not force him. Do not even entertain the notion of forcing such a person to accept artificial nutrition. Now, what's fishy about this? We quickly intuit, that we're going from monetary matters to matters of life and death, from dinei mamonot to dinei nefashot, which we don't normally do. If we use a Latin tag, monetary matters are ius dispostivium. That is, you can make a contract and include any term you want, as long as it's not against the law or it doesn't offend morality. And the law will give effect. But you can't sort of decide to murder who you fancy murdering, and contract between highwaymen and murderers will not be honored by the court. So how can Rabbi Feinstein go from the monetary issue to matters of life and death? Now, to my mind, Rabbi Feinstein is only using the kal v'chomer, the a fortiori argument, as a smokescreen. And underneath, I want to connect this responsum to his responsum on the autonomy of the young man and the idea that in matters of life and death, where the case is a hard case, the ownership of life is passed to the patient, the person concerned, and they make the decision. I think that Rabbi Feinstein's pioneering and definitely revolutionary response on the competent adult who refuses artificial nutrition reflects a principle of autonomy. Now, I think that Rabbi Feinstein does this often. His sensitivity for humanity in the face of the sacred is quite remarkable. I'm going to just take you for a second to guide dogs in the synagogue. Okay? Can you go into the synagogue with a guide dog? Rabbi Feinstein was asked a question, and he went through in a flash the whole of the Talmud as he used to do every day. And he came across a Yerushalmi in tractate Megillah that says that Rav Imi said to his students in the Bet HaMidrash, if somebody appears on the scene who has some Jewish knowledge, meluchlach ba'oraita, then you can bring them into the place of prayer, and chamrei, which could mean and their donkey. So from here we can assume that it is possible for an animal to come into the synagogue. And Rabbi Feinstein then goes on to say, and of course a blind person needs to get to the synagogue. If he is religious or she is religious, it would be very sad if they couldn't get there, and the dog is very important, so let's go ahead. Rabbi Yaakov Mordechai Breish, who survived the Holocaust and ended up in Zurich, from a different school of rabbinic thought, the author of Response to Chelkat Yaakov, disagrees. Now, he says, first of all, if it's a donkey, how do I know it applies to a dog? Secondly, the word chamrei, meaning his donkey, could mean his donkey driver. How do we say donkey driver in Hebrew? A chamar. How do you know the chamrei means the donkey? May mean the donkey driver. Anyhow, says Rabbi Breish, we have a perfect solution. We don't need to impugn the sanctity of the synagogue. Get a young man. Rabbi Breish is extremely orthodox, only thinks in terms of men. He says, let's bring a young man to go to the home of the blind person and take him by the hand. And we'll bring him to the synagogue morning, afternoon, evening, high holy days to hear the Megillah and Purim. No worries. What happened here? And who is the blind man? The blind man is Rabbi Breish, who doesn't see what Rabbi Feinstein saw without saying so in so many words, that the dignity of the blind Jew is at stake here. How does the blind Jew achieve dignity? By going to the synagogue or going anywhere with his guide dog, because that gives him his dignity. Rabbi Breish says, why do I need to get into the issue of sanctity of the synagogue? He also says, slippery slope. You bring a dog, bring in a horse, bring in an elephant, turn the synagogue into a zoo. And he says, you know what, there are some rabbis, and he uses the word Reish, Aleph, Bet, Ayin, Yud, Samach. There are some rabbis who might do that, and they'll say, upon whom do we rely? On that elderly sage from the Lower East Side, on that great posek, Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Breish doesn't get it. Rabbi Feinstein does, not in, but he doesn't say so, of course, in so many words. He goes to this section from the Jerusalem Talmud, which could be interpreted in various ways, and then he just uses the building blocks in the Talmud, I think, as a vehicle for his humanity. He understands what people need. Now, the tension then, which I'm starting to bring out here, I think, is between our humanity and our sense of the sacred. And this is where I'll get a little philosophical, perhaps ethical, before I'm due to conclude, which is quite soon. You'll be happy to know. Okay? Now, I want to begin the last section with a quote from Hans Jonas, a German Jewish philosopher, very interesting, survived the rigors of Nazi Germany, ended up teaching here at Columbia, I think, but you'll have to check on me on that, okay? You can start Googling right now. Hans Jonas, he said it is a question whether, without restoring the category of the sacred, the category most thoroughly destroyed by scientific enlightenment, we can have an ethics able to cope with the extreme powers which we possess today and constantly increase and are compelled to use. This is very incisive. Now, the biomedical field is rife with these scientific insights which are extremely powerful. We possess, we increase every day, and we are compelled to use. For that, we need to have a sense of the sacred, the things we will not do, whether it's PVS patients, whether it is things associated with enhancement of human beings, with assisted reproduction. The philosophy that underlies Rabbi Feinstein is rooted in a concept of the sanctity of life. He begins with halakhah and autonomy in the case of the dying patient, or dignity in the case of a blind person, grid into the interstices of the sacred. The starting point is we are creatures who are in awe of God, of our lives, a God-given gift, and we treat it as of infinite value, and we must be infused with that sense. If we don't, then we can descend to horrible depths and a terrible abyss. But what we need to do is we need to ameliorate the sacred with a sense of humaneness. So we begin with the halachic heteronomy, you must do. And then, in the appropriate cases, we move on to the humanity. And we wear our humanity lightly. We don't push the point. Secular systems, and I'm not going to go into anything like a finessed approach in the 5 minutes I have left. Secular systems and the way we debate and discuss bioethical matters today is rife with autonomy as the lodestar, the North Pole value. We have to choose. We must be in a position that we can choose, as that famous Jewish judge, Benjamin Cardozo, wrote in the 1914 case of Mary Schlowendorfer. Every adult human being has the right to choose and decide that which will be done with his or her life. Autonomy is the pole star. That guides us. That's not what I have presented here this evening, and I think that in philosophical terms it may be a dangerous course, because there are cases that cannot be resolved by the tools of autonomy or utilitarianism, or even the principles of bioethics as professed by Beecham and Childress or Childress. There are instances in which we want to respond to the cry for human dignity, for example, that will not be answered, philosophically speaking, by autonomy or by utility. And for that, we need to go back to something like the image of God and the sanctity of human life. So in the halachic approach, the ground floor is obligation, heteronomy, a sense of the sacred. As we build up and we hit hard cases, then the halakhah itself says, and this is the point, according to Rabbi Feinstein, the correct psak, the correct halachic decision in a hard case is sometimes to ask the patient what they think and what they want. Sometimes there are cases in which, when we're pitting humaneness against sanctity, we have to look at the individual and say, what do they want? Okay? And the blind person wanted to go to shul with the blind dog because that was the way in which the blind person fulfilled both the sacred but also the humane. The secular approach tends to go in the other direction. And I think that if we could have a cross-pollination and we can move from one to the other, there may be a lot to learn. Hence, I would certainly congratulate Michal, if it's my prerogative to do so at all, on a course and on a challenge which confronts and combines our general sense of what is ethical with our deep sense of what halakhah values, and see if we can come to a more happy combination of the two. And as I said, I do think that in Rabbi Moses Feinstein, that exceptional posek of North American Jewry, or as the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote, that elderly Jewish sage from the Lower East Side, we have a paradigm. Thank you.